everyone, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, along with Charlie Araujo. And how are you today, Charlie?
I am good. It has been nuts and going crazy, and it's Monday and one of those, but all good. It's an exciting time to be around the world of tech and enterprise tech in particular, as today's just cornucopia of news and analysis will show.
Sure is. Obviously, Agentic AI has been in the news, but we're actually seeing some interesting stories in the more mundane storage and employment and employee engagement areas as well.
Yeah, this week feels a little bit more normal. It's not all AI all the time, although we
Yes.
will keep with tradition with how we end today's session. So if you've been watching our episodes, then you'll know what we're going to finish talking about because it's what we always end up talking about at the end. But if you don't, you have to stick around to see what it is.
Yep, absolutely. But as a starting point, we saw some news this week around Salesforce. Obviously, Salesforce has been talking about their Agentforce offering pretty continuously since Dreamforce last year. They are revving up the media engine as they are getting ready for their Trailblazer Developer Conference, which is this week. So in full disclosure, I'll be attending there later this week and seeing what they have to say there. But before that, you noticed that there's some kind of conflicting news and announcements going on right now about Agentforce.
So first, start with full disclosure. So Symphony AI, I don't consider us a competitor to Salesforce, but we do have an agentic AI product that we're bringing to market. So we're in the space. So that out. And then secondly, I've been a long time fan of Salesforce. I mean, it's hard not to admire their marketing engine and their sales engine and how they go to market. And Mark Benioff is a consummate salesperson that's been out there. And so it was quite fascinating in last week's earnings report or earnings call where they talked about it. And so it was manifest in two different articles. The one by CIO Dive talked about how Salesforce, I'll read the title, Salesforce ends 2025 fiscal year with a quarter of Agentforce. That's a quote from Benioff. And the subheading is the AI and data cloud segment contributes 900 million of annual recurring revenue during the provider's fiscal year. And they talk about in this thing that there's 3,000 paying customers using Agentforce. So it sounds amazing. And then there's another article by Tom Kavitz, I think I always get his name, Krazit, who writes Runtime. Big fan. He's a great analyst. Not a traditional analyst. He's really more of a traditional journalist. We just don't have a lot of those left. And he dove into this and said what was really fascinating is that in between Benioff's statements in the earnings report, the CFO came on and had to do, of course, because they're a publicly held company, do like the much more somber disclosure sort of stuff. And in that, the quote was that there is no meaningful contribution in 2026 from Agentforce on a revenue side. So that 900 million is really coming from their other existing products. And by the by, on the street, I'm hearing a lot of very similar things that the Agentforce, these 2,000 salespeople that Salesforce has apparently hired, are having a little bit of a rough go of getting enterprises to actually adopt all of this. And so I think these two stories are like epitomize the state that we're in this market right now. Massive amounts of hype, massive amounts of pressure to deliver results and to show that all of these massive investments are paying off. And this is not just with Salesforce or even the agentic AI space specifically, but clearly with OpenAI, with Microsoft, with everyone who's invested gobs and gobs of money around this. They're being pressured to demonstrate results. And yet, as we all know, as people that have been in the enterprise and lived in the enterprise for a long time, enterprises move slowly and cautiously, and they're resource constrained. And I think all of these are two colliding forces right now. So it was just sort of fun that these both appeared like literally on the same day. Two articles about the same earnings report, taking two wildly different sort of tones about it.
Yes, I think that it's going to be common in the next few months to see a bunch of bundling of data offerings and AI and talking about the growth there. When this might mean a growth to your customer data platform or to your analytics offering or to your data management and integration offering along with AI, because the honest truth is it's still hard to both buy AI and to support AI. I feel like selling Agentforce or any agentic platform right now is often like putting the cart before the horse because there isn't necessarily the tools. The tools are not necessarily in place to support agents at scale. So say I want to put 20,000 agents in place in my enterprise. That means I have to manage 20,000 agents. I have to update them. I have to make sure they all stay up to date as I continue customizing and configuring my core Salesforce environment. All these things that have to be in place, and I have to be able to test every single agent, which probably means throwing 1,000 different prompts at the agent to make sure that the most commonly asked questions don't come out with really weird answers that could put me in some sort of governance or compliance bind. So all of this stuff needs to be put in place before putting out those billion agents that Benioff wants to have in place. He's literally said this billion number.
Yeah, well, and I think this is the issue. I've been I'm bullish on the space over the long haul. I've been fairly vocal in my skepticism in the short term because of all the, particularly with these builder platforms like Agentforce, because there's so much of a heavy lift and there's so much infrastructure that has to be built. There's so many potential challenges with the data estate. And that's why I think you're seeing, we didn't report it in this particular feed, but Snowflake reported really solid earnings growth last week. I think it was in the 20 or 30% range, and just and so I think we're seeing the sort of history, right, where the people that are selling the picks and the shovels right now are doing very, very well because there's all this infrastructure that has to get built around all of it. And I think again, it's also borne out in that CIOs are these days, I think, a pretty smart bunch, and they understand these implications and ramifications, and they have to make these trade-offs, and so they are, I think, encouragingly not buying blindly into all of the hype, and are kind of moving more cautiously. And it's going to be this interesting thing that is going to get borne out over time. And I think the challenge, and this is ironic because it's an analyst firm, but I think the challenge is also sort of coming to head in IDC's announcement with what they're calling TechMatch, and they're calling it a AI enhanced tool that provides self-service vendor evaluations. And what's most interesting about this from my standpoint is that IDC is an analyst firm. I've actually have a lot of respect for IDC. I think they do good stuff. I think their analysts are generally really solid. But this is a whole lot of hand waving. I had to read through this, and it's like they injected a little bit of Gen AI into this to ask some questions or whatever. But the fundamental of what this is, it's a data platform to go and search through their analyst data, and then combine it with stuff from like G2 or whatever. And I read through this going, where's the AI? There was barely any in it. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, this is still, it's funny. They call it TechMatch, and IDC is kind of calling this an AI thing, but it is really a very limited tool at this point. I'm still waiting for an analyst firm to take advantage of the 10, 20, 30 years of proprietary information they have, the thought process of their best analysts, and being able to translate that into some sort of meaningful generative AI product. And I've seen bits and pieces coming out from some of the smaller firms, but nothing that I would consider to be really interesting from a strategic perspective. There's nothing that I would see CIOs purchasing to share with their chief strategy officer or their chief legal counsel to really dig into the nuts and bolts of tech strategy.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting. I think I think there's a bit of an internal conflict of interest there in terms of why analyst firms are always hesitant to do that. The irony is that I think they are tapping into a very distinct need, particularly in this age where there's so much technology, so many vendors. I mean, I live in this every single day, and I have trouble keeping track of it all. I mean, I'm constantly Googling. It's like, what does this company do again? And those are just the big ones, right? I mean, for every big giant company, there's hundreds of other companies. And so it's really, really tough. And if you're a CIO, trying to make sense of all of that is challenging. And so I think there's a great need for a product like this from an independent third party. But I just don't know that, at least on the surface, it looks like it's going to do it. But in either case, other big news as we continue down with industry news, IBM completed one acquisition, announced another one. They definitely have had an acquisition appetite lately. And you had definitely some. I saw your post on LinkedIn, a couple of distinct opinions about both of these. So the first was their acquisition of DataStax, and then they also completed their acquisition of HashiCorp. Both good acquisitions for them, I think, in my opinion. But why don't you kind of walk us through and what you think of it?
Yeah, so DataStax has been going to market, is supporting Cassandra, NoSQL database. So fancy way of saying that they are supporting unstructured and semi-structured data in their database store, and then allowing companies to be able to query that data. So obviously, if you're trying to get a bunch of data, put it in one place, and then being able to query it afterwards, either for traditional analytics or for AI, a store like DataStax is a great managed service to be able to do that. And they've been working with IBM pretty closely since, I want to say, 2020 or 2021, because IBM saw the same thing. They wanted to support large enterprise stores and get into the AI game and further into the AI game, and saw DataStax as a good partner. So IBM said, hey, let's just close the deal. We have been working with these guys for a long time, and we want to make sure that we stay close and continue contributing to the Apache Cassandra project. So I think all of these are good reasons for these two companies to be together, and it's a good
So I think
exit for DataStax.
definitely good exit for DataStax. IBM is sort of in the middle ground as far as I'm concerned. I think that they're not as bad as, say, SAP or Broadcom, where if you get acquired by them, you just sort of die in the vine, in my opinion. But I do think that they represent a challenge in that they're just a big giant company and they haven't done a great job. Like I think they made really good acquisitions and they have a good end-to-end portfolio, but I don't think they have a great end-to-end story. I don't think they are bringing these to market in a coordinated fashion in a way that I think they could and should. I forgot the name, but I thought they already had a NoSQL type database product, and so I guess I'm also curious your take on how they're going to reconcile that.
Yeah, I think specifically DataStax is useful because it's a vector database. So it's helpful for the vectorization specifically associated with AI models. Yes, IBM has a ton of databases already under management, no doubt. But I think the market, simply the market share associated with DataStax is helpful from an IBM perspective.
Sure.
I
Well,
totally
so the
agree
other
with you on
acquisition,
the acquisition side that IBM has struggled to translate great acquisitions into great ongoing products. I think they've done a better job under the Arvind Krishna era than they did under the Ginni Rometty era. And I think the Red Hat acquisition has been a little bit of a guiding light for IBM to figure out how to keep just enough independence to keep moving forward without just shoving them into an IBM bucket or box.
well, and I think not to get off track with this or off topic, but I think that's the challenge. I think prior to the Red Hat acquisition, they had a pretty well known history of just sort of squashing the life out of the companies they'd acquire. The founders would leave, and Red Hat sort of flipped it upside down. Red Hat became the tail that wagged the dog and was seen as a wildly successful and in many ways reinvigorating IBM. And so I feel to a certain extent they've tried to replicate that model. The difference is that Red Hat was an 800-pound gorilla. They were a massive organization. They had a massive footprint in the market. And most of these other folks do not, right? These other acquisitions we're talking about. And they would stand a tremendous amount of benefit of having an integrated story that links all of this together. And so, that to me is the miss or the opportunity. I fully appreciate in companies as large as this, it's very difficult. And, given the two polar extremes, I would pick the one they're taking versus the integrated all costs and squash everything. But I still think there's a missed opportunity. Anyway, be that as it may, the other one is they completed the acquisition of HashiCorp, which I think, again, good. I love the play, and I love the play particularly for IBM in that IBM is central to almost anybody's hybrid IT strategy, something I'm a firm believer is will remain the future for a long time. So I think this is good. I think that overall it sort of puts this one to bed. I mean, did you have any other kind of take? You brought this one up. I mean, why are we talking about it other than the fact that it actually closed?
Yeah, I just think that overall infrastructure provisioning is a key challenge. IBM has obviously been focused on this as a hybrid cloud automation uh, and support company at this point. They realize their real challenge is they are trying to support 50,000 person enterprises with really complex hybrid infrastructure needs. That is what IBM at its core is good at in 2025. So let's go with that and keep bringing in pieces that help support that. I feel like they've also been looking at little tools like IBM Concert that have been helping to look at root cause analysis for infrastructure, but HashiCorp obviously is able to do a lot of these automation and infrastructure support capabilities at a much higher level, and has a lot of, again, adoption and an open source background that IBM has also been pursuing for a while.
One of the things I do think is interesting, going back to what I was just talking about, I think HashiCorp has the opportunity for them to be a bit of a tip of the spear. It is a much more strategic product that, based on where it sort of sits in the flow. And so it could be an interesting for them to be able to hook a bunch of other things to it and use it as an entry point. I think it's tough though, just because IBM is so entrenched that, these aren't like your normal sales motions where we're trying to talk to a new company, right? IBM does business with everybody already. And so I think that makes it sort of challenging. Along the same lines, however, you brought up, and we're going to take a quick pause of industry news to talk about this particular article from the Register. But basically it was, I don't know, an analysis, I guess, of open source licensing and its evolution in the enterprise state. And we're talking about it right now because they specifically in this article called out 3 projects, one of which was HashiCorp's Terraform. And really the point of this article is that as organizations that are for-profit entities that own the rights, or so to speak, of the open source, I don't even know how to say that, whether the sponsors or whatever of these open source projects, that they end up often having some conflicts as they attempt to monetize and come under pressure to deal with it. So why did you share this, and what was your sort of thought processes around it?
Yeah, so the Register took a quick look at the State of OpenCon 2025 keynote done by Dr. Dawn Foster. And she pointed out that there were some interesting shifts going on here with open source increasingly, as we're seeing kind of the split between open source that is in practice maintained by a single vendor versus open source that is supported by a maintainer community or some sort of organization that is made of a multiple companies or multiple maintainers, and seeing how some of these major open source tools, so Terraform is mentioned, Redis is mentioned, Elasticsearch is mentioned, have been forked off by maintainers that want a more independent or less vendor focused solution. Yeah, and so this seems to be a kind of split that is happening in the open source world. So all these solutions may still be open source, but now you have to look at the maintainer community or communities involved associated with the tool to see which one really fits kind of the open source philosophy that we typically consider to be open.
What I think is interesting about this is that I don't think this is entirely new. I feel like this has been an ongoing thing for a number of years, and I always found interesting as an analyst when I would meet with a company that was doing a briefing and they would talk about they were in fact open source. Yet they were a for-profit entity. They were not this community project. I always thought it was interesting that because it's a very conflicted go-to-market model, right? When you are doing that, I'm less suspect of a company like AWS that simply takes an open source project and says, we're going to deploy this and support it and whatever, it's still open source or whatever. But I look at this and say, at the end of the day, it's sort of well, I guess there's 2 ways of looking at it. But if you're a CIO, this is all sort of academic, because you're going to go with a company to maintain support it in general. It's very rare that a CIO of an enterprise organization is going to take a true open source product and truly take the open source version of it and manage it on their own. So, for them, it just sort of pushes it. I think the real question here is there value and I think this is to me the core question that this article and this doctor is trying to make, is there actually value in an open source project that is predominantly driven by and supported by a company? Or are they simply doing the sort of hand waving of saying we're open source, but for all intents and purposes, it's just another product? And that's I think the interesting question about it.
Mhm.
And I don't know if there's an answer, or if it even matters from your perspective.
I think it's an interesting problem because a couple of the comparisons made here are with Elasticsearch forking off, being forked off by Amazon and have which created OpenSearch. But there, AWS is obviously a strong corporate sponsor for a project. Whereas if you look at, say, HashiCorp Terraform forking off OpenTofu, that's supported by Foundation, which may be okay, but then you're starting to deal with a more diverse set of contributors and wondering which aspects of the project will be maintained over time. And it's been interesting to see how this open source maintenance has been supported. We're starting to see companies like Tidelift show up. Tidelift is a company that literally exists to map individual contributors and maintainers at the open source level with projects that may be unmanaged, and making sure that that is being bridged when you don't have a large corporate sponsor in place.
I mean, the way I look at this is I sort of feel, and the lines blur, particularly if you get into the really large enterprises. But the way I look at this is, if you're a CIO, you're going to be focused on these projects that, you're buying AWS OpenSearch, or you're buying the stuff that is supported by the company, because it's at the end of the day, that's really what you're buying. What I think is interesting is where I think the community projects are much more valuable and supportable is when it's a core technology that is predominantly used by the hyperscalers or by the large cloud providers or whomever, because they have a vested interest in having sort of this common platform. They can all contribute resources. They have resources they can afford to contribute it. It makes a lot of sense. And I think that's where this starts to break down. And so I sort of think from an CIO's perspective, this is sort of an academic thing, but I think it's useful to bring up, to be aware of, because we always have to be concerned about the future roadmap of products and projects, and making sure that we don't get left in a bind. Speaking of which, big news out of Microsoft that they have finally done something. I actually had to check to see if I still had the app loaded on my phone, because I thought it was gone a while ago. And that is that they've officially announced the retirement of Skype, and transitioning the remaining, I think it's 5 million users, which is shockingly still a large number, into Microsoft Teams. And I don't think there's any big impact for most organizations, particularly because of the transition into Teams. This isn't just a project that is going away. But there is a bit of a nostalgic hit for me. It's like, wow, this was like such a huge thing when it came out. So I don't know how you feel about it, if you have any connection with Skype.
Yeah, I just feel like, I'm pouring one out for Skype. But back when I started as an analyst in the late 2000s, I was actually tracking Skype as an enterprise messaging and communications product, because in the web, with the WebExes and GoToMeetings and the unified communication solutions that were out there, there were a lot of companies that were still choosing Skype as a product to manage that, despite the fact that it was not enterprise secure and did not integrate with anything, but because it was so easy to use. And even up until 2019, Skype had 300 million users. They seemed perfectly positioned to be a solution for the COVID lockdown and pandemic. But frankly, Zoom wanted that business more and was more willing to transform their product at the end of the day to support the educational and other use cases that started coming out. And as a result, we saw Zoom take off and Skype kind of disappear and get subsumed into Teams and kind of disappear. So I just feel like, this was a product that introduced telecom and conferencing via the web or via the internet to so many people, and yet every I guess company every product meets its end at some point.
Well, it was sort of a product caught between two eras, right? It sort of came of age really at the tail end of the bulletin board sort of era, and it was
Hmm.
a revolutionary approach to all of that at the time. To your point, there's a complete dearth of any option similar to that in the enterprise space, and so of course, that's when Microsoft acquired them because companies were looking at this saying, "Hey, here's this massive messaging platform." But then eventually Microsoft found other ways to meet that problem and could do it in a more concerted way, and it just sort of sat there, and that was
Hmm.
always the issue with it. I remember there wasn't, I mean, in its early days, it was one of the items when you fill out a profile, it's like, what's your Skype handle, right? And then it was
Hmm.
like this big thing. And so, it is sort of sad, but it's like it never quite found its footing in enterprise, and therefore it never found its sort of new home. And so it had all these, I was one of those 300 million users, and I used
Hmm.
it almost never. And that's, I think that was the challenge with it as time went on. So I am
Yep.
sad. I agree. It's sort of the march, but it's also a reminder that you always have to be innovating. You always have to find ways to stay relevant, or you sort of fall off. But it's also part of the game. It's continual, particularly for these large enterprise tech companies. You constantly make investments and you reassess on a constant basis. And Microsoft wasn't doing that just with Skype. There was also some news, and I don't think this has been officially confirmed by Microsoft. So there's some scuttlebutt going around the industry that people are picking this up, and maybe you have more insight on this. But basically, the word is that Microsoft has canceled a whole bunch of their data center leases, um, which is a little bit difficult to reconcile given that they've made these announcements of, I think, what, $85 billion in investments, and yet, right, and this sort of balancing act. So I just think it's some interesting news to hear that Microsoft is going down this road.
Yeah. So rumors has it from a TD Bank note. They're saying TD Bank said that they were checking with their data center sources and seeing that Microsoft has been pulling back on existing data center leases and in converting commitments into leases on the data side. And this is no doubt associated with the recent findings that we're able to do a bunch of AI testing and training much more cheaply and with less power than previously thought with the DeepSeek announcement and related announcements from China. So Microsoft is now saying we're not going to spend quite as much on data center work at the same time that OpenAI is chasing for more data center power and going to SoftBank. I think Microsoft basically said we are tired of paying for all this extra data center capacity that we don't think we actually need to move the ball forward as we're trying to productize AI at this point.
Well, and I do think there's probably a relationship to where we opened the show and the Salesforce showing sort of a slowness in the uptake within the enterprise. I think there's been plenty of reporting about Microsoft struggling to see the numbers that they had expected with their Copilot product
Mm-hmm.
and some of their other agentic or AI in general solutions. And so I do think sort of a slower rate of adoption that seems to be clearly the case across most enterprises. And the fact that there was just this arguably overinvestment, this rapid elevation of those data center investments, and then you throw in the kicker of DeepSeek causing everyone to go, "Do we really need all this capacity? Is that really what's going to be necessary?" So, and again, all this is a rumor; it may all not even be true. So, who knows? But it is an interesting statement. And again, it's sort of I compare this to the fact that Nvidia just had their latest number and they blew the doors off their earnings
Mm-hmm.
and their profit and their revenue again, staggeringly high, reducing their projections, their guidance for the next quarter a little bit, but still shockingly high considering how much they're already selling. And so you put all together, and you end up with a big giant question mark, right? It's just really, really difficult to understand where this is all playing. So I don't, again, if I put my CIO hat on, does any of this matter? I don't know. I think that it's going to be a continually moving ball and trying to, it's going to be like watching the hockey puck from the cheap seats, and you have to just keep your eyes peeled and try to follow along.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is that anytime you're investing in a data center, that is like piloting an ocean liner, right? It's a 5 to 10 year process. You can't just open up a data center in a month and get going and be ready to go. And I think CIOs have to keep this in mind, that the guide rails around AI data centers are still in flux, and don't just be careful and don't throw all your money into capex, even if you're a large enterprise who is betting heavily on AI. There's still a little bit of conservative nature you should put into that investment.
Well, and it's why I've always been a huge proponent of both, moving away from on-prem data centers, whether that's colo or cloud, and being very smart about how you do that. Why we talked about HashiCorp and the hybrid IT sort of model, and why I'm a huge fan of that, because it's all about striking that balance and giving yourself enough flexibility. You're constantly tuning it. And it's also why I'm a big fan of multi-cloud, right? This idea of having multiple irons, and it's just all you're doing is adding more dials, right? And getting yourself, creating as much flexibility as you can so that you can adjust things as you go. What is interesting, there's another piece of news, I guess, a study that you found from Wasabi, who I've never heard of, by the way, which is interesting. And the headline, their big headline here, is that over half of global organizations are experiencing IT or business delays due to cloud storage fees. And most of these are, ironically enough, due to data lock-in. The fact that so much of this cost is being affiliated, and there's the repatriation or the data egress fees,
Right.
being able to move data, or the ability to consume that data, can actually make it hard. So costs are rising. And it shows this other point of this, is you have to figure out how to strike this balance. And we've talked a lot about this, like from a FinOps standpoint, right? Is that you need to be focused on looking at your workloads very critically. The answer to every question is not move it to the cloud, but you have to be diligent in looking at your data, looking at your financial models, and understanding how this all plays out. And I think the stakes around this are going to get even higher when we get to AI. So this nothing in this Wasabi report surprised me at all. It was almost slightly discouraging to see how significant the overruns are, how poor the visibility apparently that many enterprises are having. Although FinOps companies are probably loving this report, so I guess that's good for them. But what was your take on it?
Yes, absolutely. It was pretty straightforward as well for me too, that half of storage costs are not associated with capacity, but with egress, with transport, the stuff that we are taking for granted when we just want to copy and paste something. It's so easy to drag that drive over from one place to another, or that table from one place to another, just copy asterisks and not think about what the cost of that is. Yet we have to start thinking about where our data lives as part of this analytics and AI processes, especially with AI, where it's going to be easier for us to have as much data in one place as possible, but perhaps we have to think about whether to actually move that data or not, or whether we might need other strategies to look at multiple data sources at once with our model. Just think about which one makes more sense for your organization, and actually look at the price rather than simply saying, well, this is the easiest thing for me to move over.
So I'm curious. I'm going to do a little segue here. I'm curious. Because this is not unique to this space. I remember I had the same problem I covered the whole data space for a while, and the data warehousing and data lakes and data lake houses, all of that. And my fundamental challenge was always that it was the same premise, right? Dump all your data here, just stick it all here, and then we'll figure out what to do with it. And it perpetuates the same issue, right? That if we aren't being diligent with understanding the fundamentals of the problem, understanding our workloads, our workflows, our data flows, all of this, right? Really understanding how the environment operates, so that we can therefore understand how we're going to execute against that, whether it's data, whether it's cloud, whether it's whatever. Whether it's AI, as we look at these AI flows, that you're going to run into these problems over and over and over again. But so here's my question: as an analyst, as a former IT guy, is this vendors' fault? Is this that vendors go and do all the hype, and we sell it as this, hey, this is the answer to all your problems? Is this that there's just a lack of diligence on the IT side? Is it CIOs that they just want the easy answer? Please just solve all my problems for me. I mean, how do we keep getting into the situation over and over again?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lack of hybrid observability capability across the IT department, where it's the like the blind man and the elephant problem. Everybody grabs a part of the elephant and says, this tail is like a snake or this leg is like a tree, and that's all they see of the entire picture, and nobody sees the entire picture across the 1,000+ apps and the probably petabyte of data that the enterprise has. Nobody's looking at that from an activity and workload perspective holistically, and so you have a lot of these niche decisions that are made, and then they're scaled up, and then people find out, oh, those weren't good decisions, because nobody's looking at the big picture across the board. And it's frustrating to see, because as you say, Charlie, it's not a new story. This has been an issue for a long time, and going back to IBM's HashiCorp specifically, that's going to be one of the solutions that really helps with that kind of visibility, because it's been lacking.
Well, and I think, and I fear that we're going to replicate these exact same challenges if we start talking about AI, particularly the agentic AI, which is why I'm so critical of the builder approaches to this. And this leads into the next topic, and this is another study, this one by Pew Research, that is saying that only 12% of employees have had training in AI. And I was struck by this study for two reasons, right? The first is that, A, that's a very low number, but secondly, it's a low number in part because I feel like they're asking the wrong question. And what I mean by that is, if I think about this, so let me go back to where I started, right? Why I'm so challenged with the Salesforce or ServiceNow's approach to this agentic builder technology is that it starts with the preposition that our employees have the capability and the desire to spend their time building AI agents. And if that's what we're trying to do, then we absolutely need to train them. But the real question is, I mean, I think back to the days of Chef. Remember Chef? Chef and all their recipes, and how the minute anyone got 5 minutes into the implementation, started realizing what a disaster it was to try to manage all of that, right? Because it became the same problem with the RPA vendors, right? We get down that road, it sounds really great, and when a single use case, you start deploying it across 1,000 use cases, and it's like you got this explosion of a management issue. And we're already seeing, ironically enough, like ServiceNow's coming to market saying, you're going to have to solve this problem, right? So we're going to help you manage that. And it's just like, so I found myself when I was reading this particular study from Pew, it's like, why are we going down this road? What is the skill set that I need an employee to have? Do I need them to understand how AI works? Do I need to understand for them to understand how to build an AI agent? And I think the answer should be, I think for me, the answer should be no. That isn't what I want. I want them to understand how to use AI and apply it in their job to get results that make them wildly productive, or that somehow transform the way they work, or to help them identify how they can transform the way they work. But it's sort of like, I remember talking to people, this was just a few years ago, where it's like, where this idea that every employee had to be a technologist, it's like, no, I don't want them to be coders. That's just the complete backwards way of looking at this. I want them to understand enough to ask the hard questions and to figure out how to apply it. And I feel like we're going down the same road with AI, that within the enterprise anyway, that we're just looking at it wrong.
Yeah, it's the same problem that we've had with data analysts, that back in the day, Tableau wanted to turn everybody into a data analyst, and they did a lot of evangelization. They taught a ton of people, probably millions of people have learned how to use Tableau. But at the end of the day, still only about 25% of employees have data analyst skills, and the other 75% do not want to be data analysts. Even fewer people want to be developers than want to be data analysts. And so this is always going to be a problem. And I feel like the other problem with AI agents right now is that it requires a certain amount of creativity about your job, both to say, here's the 50% of work that I don't want to ever do again, as well as here's maybe the 20% of the work that is high value and that I want to do more of. And figure out, how do I reimagine my job to be more agentic? That's a creativity issue. And in some cases, there are unfortunately jobs where 100% of the work is scut work, and those people have zero reason to try to agentify their job.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the things, and this is another article we didn't bring into our thing, so we could have had even longer. But it talked about the fact that one of the challenges is that we need to be looking at AI about more than just productivity, but about this reimagining of how we function all together. And to your point, that's not going to happen at an individual employee level, and you have to get this bigger picture. So it was.
Mhm.
I think there's to me two big takeaways from this particular Pew research. One is that we absolutely need to be investing in our employees. We need to. The more staggering number was 49% of employees had zero training. It's like, okay, way to
Mhm.
invest in our employees, companies. But we need to be training our employees. We need to be investing in them, but we need to be doing it very intensely. Honestly, it's the same story about the rest of this. It's like we need to look at all of this, our entire estate, whether that's our workflows, our data flows, our workloads, our work. I've lost the workflows and, and workloads, and our employees, and look at all of this holistically and make sure that we are investing in the right ways and the right things and in a way that's going to actually move us forward. And yes, that's a lot more work. It's not cookie cutter. You can't go and just take whatever a vendor is selling you and say plug it in and here we go. But the net result of that is you end up with a much better, compelling solution. And that leads us to where I guess we're sort of ending with two. We used to say fun, but these are probably not fun as much as they are just weird or sad stories. And so we're going to end up with two of them, I guess. The first is um, Google's Sergey Brin, the one of its co-founders, who's now still one of the major stockholders, just made this weird announcement. I forgot where it was now. But basically, I guess he sent out a memo internally saying that everyone should be in the office every day of the week, at least every day. I love that. At least every
Mhm.
weekday, and you should be doing 60 hours, and that's how we're going to win and compete in AI. And so there's a New York Times article. The information was very pointed in saying, "What's like, well, dude, you own a quarter of the company still. You could just make this happen." Um, and but probably for me, even the bigger thing was I looked at this and said, God, this is just a classic case of what not to do. If I'm a CIO, I want to hold this up and wave it and say, this is the example of how not to function because
Mhm.
it's demoralizing and debilitating to your employees. You're basically saying that the reason we're sucking in this in the industry and we're behind is because you're not working hard enough, right? So it's completely absent any sense of leadership. And it also completely, I think, underestimates just the reality of the situation is that AI is about fundamentally, it's about creativity and about thinking and about new ideas, and it's not about just more hours to the grindstone. So I found the whole thing just totally backwards and bizarre.
Yes, I will bet, dollars to donuts. Google is not losing at AI because it lacks talent or because it isn't spending enough money in this space. Those are definitely not the reasons that Google is losing. Google is losing because it is having trouble bringing those great ideas to the market and productizing them. And that's not a problem that more hours will solve. They have to get better at prioritizing what actually matters, bringing the top ideas to market and focusing on those. That's the real issue there. And I think the other challenge is that more hours is not always better. I feel like, as we talked about right before this call, Charlie, every mistake I've ever had to fix at the enterprise level was a major fix was done by somebody who was working more than 50 hours a week. They had gotten to working at 8 p.m., 10 p.m., and midnight. They thought they were being a hero and they screwed something up royally that had to be redone. We had to go back to the archives. We had to erase the last week of work to get back to a point that we could clean it up. That's always been the case as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it is. I think there's this weird sort of ethos, and it leads us to the last topic that we're going to cover. And so again, if you've been watching our episodes, you know what it is. What are we going to talk about to end our show it seems to be our new tradition? What is it, Han?
The government, Elon Musk, DOGE.
Specifically Elon Musk and DOGE and all the craziness that's going on. And so there's two related stories here on the same topic. And I say that it's linked because I feel like there's the same ethos that Elon Musk seems to be bringing in, that it's just like, well, it's just because these people are lazy and they're stupid, and that's why all this is going. And so the two big pieces of news, and you can talk about them whichever order you want. The first is that he shut down a group called 18F, which is sort of the sister group to the
The
group that
digital
DOGE
services.
was right,
Yeah.
digital services that was specific to GSA, and it was also an extremely well-regarded group of mostly technologists from outside the government that would be brought in as a tiger team and develop new technologies and deploy stuff, and it was generally seen as wildly successful. I personally view this as Elon Musk just trying to shut down the competition. And then the other thing was the big news was that he announced that there was all this, war on software licenses, and this one I had mixed feelings about because on the one hand, he's doing what he's been doing, which is just taking a little piece of a little nugget of data and waving it up like, see, proof of all these problems. But as anyone who's worked in the enterprise, particularly in the government, knows that. So what he was pointing out is in one of these companies, they had 3 times many licenses for a product than they had employees.
Mhm.
But licenses are not always employee related, as this article points out. In many cases, in particular for the government, it's cheaper for them to buy it because they get mandated at lower rates and then provide them to suppliers. Sometimes you need it for machine licenses. There's all kinds of reasons. And the hard part is, I also know in many organizations, enterprises included, software management, license management specifically, is incredibly difficult, and there's often a lot of waste. So my guess is there's probably some truth to this, but again, it's the bull in the china shop sort of, look at how horrible this is. Look at how clearly only me, the savior, can come save it. That just it takes what could be a win and turns it into a loss and makes it political because we aren't really addressing the issue. So just again, more craziness from Elon Musk that I think is doing more harm than good. But what was your take on these two?
Yeah, and the irony is, so 18F, the agency that was just closed down, actually worked specifically on software optimization. They literally provide guides to other departments saying, here's how you negotiate contracts. Here is how you optimize your licenses. Here is how you maintain your vendor relationships so that you set yourself up for success and can save money. They've saved hundreds of millions of dollars in software negotiations by doing things like you get 20,000 licenses instead of 15,000, but you get a 90% discount if you get up to 20,000. So it's going to be a lot cheaper for you at the end of the day. They were literally one of the guardrails that were helping to cut costs. I don't know how else to say this, but we got rid of the people who were trying to actually saving money over the past decade. So whatever DOGE is doing, it's pretty obvious by now that they're not here to cut costs. They are here to, as you said, get rid of the competition. One of the interesting notes I saw on Blue Sky was Mark Cuban weighing in on this and saying literally, hey, 18F guys, I know you're really talented. If you want to start your own consulting firm to get ready for when the federal government needs to bring you back, I'm willing to help support you or even fund you if that's the case. So here's this billionaire smelling money at this opportunity.
Well, I mean, and that is, I think, maybe the saddest thing about this. And like I said, I'm the first to say I have done a large amount of work with the federal government, and I saw firsthand how much waste and convolution there
Mhm.
was, and it was so difficult to get things done in many ways because of a bunch of stuff. So it's like there's a need for a degree of wrecking ballness to fix some things, and so that part I appreciate. But like 18F and the Digital Services Agency are both examples where this was the government actively and intelligently going out and trying to attract people from outside the government that would bring that expertise in to help solve these problems. And they're just single-handedly wiping that out. Some of the actual positive things that were being done. And so, that part is just it's unfortunate, and again, I think a lesson to be had here in that um, it is very easily, if you're, so let's try to bring it back to some practical reality. If you're a CIO, particularly if you're a new CIO being brought in as a turnaround or whatever, it's really easy to swing this pendulum the other direction. And the law of unintended consequences means that you're almost certainly going to throw out a whole lot of good with that bad, and that there is another way, right? That you can have a major impact, you can move quickly without breaking things, and you can involve people in the process. And I think probably that's the greatest challenge. I think, again, having spent time working in the federal and in some federal agencies, I met lots of people who wanted to do nothing more than show up to the bare minimum, collect their check, and go home. And I also met a whole bunch of incredibly diligent people that were truly invested, believed in a mission of trying to make the government work better. And the people that these sort of actions are going to affect are not the first group that you want to get rid of, but it's the second. And that's what I think is very unfortunate.
Yes, and also don't bring in Accenture, ask them to cut half of your workforce in 4 weeks, and then insist on the outcome rather than looking at the process and result.
And then everyone else shows up 6 days a week, works like 60 hours, and all will be good.
Sure, absolutely. on that extremely practical note, thanks for joining us again for this week in Enterprise Tech. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, comment, and let us know what we should be looking at for next week. Thanks a lot. Take care and see you next week.